Hey patrons, how you doing? This is a little bit late in the month, I know, although it's not too bad. Well, it's the 13th, but first Patreon video of the month, and it's a manic month. I'm actually working on a video at the moment on pole weapons, and it's so it's a video that I thought would be simple, and it's not. So first of all, I'll just mention a book. I have mentioned this book before. It's called Half-Did Weapons in Medieval and Renaissance Europe. Now, this was actually recommended to me by a couple of patrons who might be watching this video, and also a couple of other people just on the public channel in the comments. And this is by John Waldman, and it's not a particularly easy book to get hold of, unfortunately, and it's quite expensive for what it is. It is a very good book, but it's not without its flaws, shall we say. And that being said, what is in there is very, very good. Pretty much unparalleled. I can't think of any other book which goes into the detail on the polearms that it does cover. Even the construction of them and how they developed into their forms that we're used to seeing. Some bills here, for example, Gisam. And that being said, what it does miss out on is there are some very common polearms that we see in medieval and early Renaissance manuscripts that just aren't covered in here. And I have to say also, it's really scant on spears and pikes. So it really does a lot on bills and halberds, and does a fair amount on partisans, stuff like that, but it doesn't do very much at all on the good old spear. And you have to think that when proportionately the most common and sort of longest lived and also the most widespread polearm for the whole medieval period was a form of spear. And in fact, the various forms of spear, they can obviously have lots of variations, definitely deserve their own book. Maybe the original intention was to do another book looking specifically at spears and pikes, I don't know, but it's really a shame that it's not in there. Anyway, so when I'm now doing my video where I'm going to attempt to cover all of the main polearms, so what this is missing out, I think, is it doesn't give you a representative sample of all of the polearms from the medieval period. It just focuses on a particular selection. So what I'm trying to do is give a video that gives an overview of all the pole weapons from the medieval and Renaissance period, at least all of the mainstream ones. I won't go for necessarily all the weird oddities and the outliers, shall we call them. But one of the things that I don't know how much you guys have looked into this topic. So I obviously consider that compared to an average person, I know quite a lot about this topic, and I've been researching medieval polearms and well, all weapons since I was a teenager. But you know, I actually made it. I did my degree in it, and I actually tried to, you know, work for museums and that kind of stuff, which didn't pan out after my archaeology and history degree. And then I ended up doing what I do now, which is being an antique arms dealer plus YouTuber plus researcher, writer, and you know the other things I do. The one thing that always amazes me when I come to research pole weapons is how many terms there are that are bandied about, like Bohemian ear spoon and Lucerne hammer, which are repeated over and over again by people with no real source. And this is really problematic when you want to do something like make a YouTube video, because I want to make a YouTube video, and if I want to say here's a Lucerne hammer and this is how a Lucerne hammer is different to a poleaxe, what's the actual evidence for them being called Lucerne hammers? Who called them Lucerne hammers? Were the Lucerne hammers is it just one source referring to a type of what other people would call poleaxe or warhammer that happened to be carried by the Swiss? And so it's really, really problematic, and we get into this terrible minefield of medieval terminology again. And you know, the one point that always comes up is about poleaxes, and people always go, oh Matt, but it doesn't have an axe blade on it, so it's not a poleaxe. I'm afraid that's not what medieval people thought. They very clearly refer to poleaxe and adza in the Italian sources, and hache in the French sources as the poleaxe type weapon, regardless of whether it actually has an axe blade on it or not. So if a very common type is like a Lucerne hammer, is a hammer on one face and a spike on the other. And these are referred to as hash, asha, poleaxe. Doesn't matter what language you refer to, they called it a poleaxe. So the fact that it's got the word hash or axe in there is kind of irrelevant to whether it actually has an axe blade on it or not. So terminology is an absolute nightmare when we come to polearms, and you get into terms like guisarme and fauchard and corsec and ranceur. There are tons and tons and tons of words for pole weapons, and glaive, for example, because glaive is also referred to in France for a short sword, or you know, as many people would think of a glaive, they'd think of it as like a sword and a stick, as a type of pole weapon. So it gets incredibly confusing. Hilariously, since I've been researching Chinese weapons a bit, there's a parallel there, because a dao, for example, most people, if I refer to a dao, most people will think of a sword, a saber-like or falchion-like sword. But actually, a dao can also be a pole weapon. It can be a glaive. So you've actually got a parallel there in China and medieval Europe, in that the word that they use for a type of short sword can also mean a type of pole weapon, exactly the same as in Europe. So it gets incredibly confusing, and the fundamental problem is that medieval people just weren't that fussy about terminology, and different groups of people in medieval Europe used the same term to mean a completely different thing. And unfortunately, in the modern world, we all communicate through mediums like YouTube or Patreon in this case, and we all want to understand each other, and so we all want to use the same term. So, you know, if you're referring to a specific type of rifle, I mean, I know people have arguments on the internet about assault rifle and battle rifle and all of these, you know, all of these different terminologies for firearms. People have a go at me for referring to a revolver as a pistol, because they go, no, a pistol and a revolver are separate things. But not in Britain, and certainly not historically. A revolver was, and to me is, a type of pistol. Pistol just means a short-barreled firearm. But I do understand that in many parts of modern American, particularly firearm culture, a pistol is a semi-automatic pistol, it's not a revolver. So, similar thing with medieval weapons, it gets incredibly confusing, and if I call something a sputum, for example, or I call something a partisan, someone else somewhere will go, no, that's not a sputum, this is a sputum, or this is a guisarme, that's a fauchard. It's like, OMG. So, I'm regretting, this is an insight into my world here. I'm literally making this video at the moment, and I thought I'd gonna take a time out to vent to you guys, because I figure kind of like, if you're supporting me on Patreon, this is maybe the sort of thing behind the scenes that might interest some of you. This is a nightmare, and I wish that I'd chosen a different topic. But anyway, I'm going to try and make it as concise and clear as possible, but I'm also going to note the fact that terminology is a nightmare, because it is, particularly when we get into medieval pole weapons. Any thoughts, impressions, feedback, as always, welcome underneath this video, and thanks for support, thanks for watching, and I'll see you real soon again here on Patreon, and of course on YouTube. See ya.